Finally, Dune is here. It has finally premiered at Venice, and we're getting some real feedback from critics, fans, assorted people in the industry. And it is mainly positive, but I'm going to have to be the bearer of bad news. This is, again, mostly going to be an empirical work through. It can't be systemic because, again, the data keeps changing. New people, new critics are chiming in. I'm just going to give a big general survey of the fans, the critics, and other people. And it is mostly good news, but there is some bad news. So let's start off with the good news, and that is that mostly, overwhelmingly, it seems, from people who have seen it at Venice, as well as other people who got previews, not necessarily at Venice. Some people were able to get previews of the film as well. They're mainly positive. They have mostly good things to say about the world building, the storytelling, the performances, the sound design, the music. Very, very positive. They're comparing it to the best films of all time. They're very confident that Denis has given us a great adaptation and all that. And from what I've seen on Twitter, and I'm speaking of Twitter specifically because I keep up with that very well, it is mainly positive. There are a few people who are like naysayers and things like that, but the overwhelming majority are very, very positive, and they've given many tweets that say this is a great film. You should see it in theaters and support it. Now we're getting to the more bad to mixed news, which is that the Rotten Tomatoes score is finally here because there are enough critics who have seen it. It's just in the low 20s, though it keeps changing. So I've got two snapshots. Earlier in the morning, it was in the low 80s, which wasn't too good, but the last time I checked, just about an hour ago, it's in the mid 80s, and they've got a few more critics. And again, it's mostly positive. Some critics think some parts were really bad or disappointing, like the lead performances, or Denis was too focused on certain technical details, right? The narrative was a little too slow or sluggish, especially towards the second half. There is a lot of commonality in the more critical people that the second half of part one, essentially the Baron conspiracy, when that's through and they have to flee into the desert, that felt very, very shaky and it dragged on. And there's a lot of agreement that it ends in a very weird place. It ends just very abruptly, and it's just not a good cliffhanger to get us to the sequel. So, in terms of the more moderate critics, they're mostly very positive still. Again, I don't think Rotten Tomatoes is a good scientific score. I don't. But it is a fair, rough approximation of where at least some critics are. And now we get to the truly bad news, which is there's a minority, and it is a minority, but they are very vocal, of critics who range from it was good but not great to this is downright terrible and really stupid and really a complete misfire. Now, I'm just going to say I went through these critics more thoroughly. Again, I only went through a couple. I went through like through 5 or 6 reviews, but I read them carefully. And here is my basic report. I'll go more in depth in other videos because this is just a general survey video. I have to say, while I do think they voiced some legitimate concerns about the pacing, and they can bring up some legitimate points in terms of how well Denis handled the technology he was using and whether the sound design or music was as great as it's supposed to be, I'm somewhat in sympathy that basically Hans Zimmer is doing the same old thing. It's not really groundbreaking. He's using apparently completely brand new instruments, but he's not really doing new stuff. So I'm somewhat sympathetic in terms of their negative points, but I did find this very, very common. And there is a kind of happy note at the end. A lot of these more critical people keep claiming they've read the book or know the Dune mythology, but they make a lot of similar mistakes and a lot of common errors, and they just get some basic things wrong. I'm going to point to a few things in some particular people. Like one person really lazily compared Paul to Jesus, and I'm like, no, that's not true. They compare him to a white savior. And right away, it's like, you clearly did not read the book. We know for a fact within the fictional universe, Duke Leto is mixed race. Gotta repeat this very carefully. He is not white. So if he's the father of Paul, and even the Harkonnens clearly have interbred with lots of different people. They're technically not white either. So therefore, Paul cannot factually be called white. If you're just going to call him a white savior, you haven't read the book carefully. And then the killer thing that gets me, and this is very uniform, again, among people who didn't like it, is that they keep saying the book is set in the year 10,000 something. No, that is simply not true. The book does not follow the AD calendar. It has its own calendar system. You can convert it. Believe me, there's a lot of different calculations. There's general agreement that the real year would have to be 22,000, 23,000 AD. But if you're just copying and saying, it's set in the future 10,000, That is not true. That is simply not in the books. That is not in the mythology. This is just you being lazy and not thinking through what the number means, which means when you say, I really read the book or I know the mythology, you don't read the books carefully and or you don't know the mythology. A lot of these people are claiming, I don't know, I mean, I think the book was okay, but this one is... It's like if you're making these common mistakes, and it's very common, and they keep doing this over and over again, I'm being very doubtful that you really know what the hell you're talking about. Still, we do have to judge these critics fairly because they are talking about the cinematic experience. So even if they concede they really don't know the book, they don't really know the mythology, are they raising legitimate points? I think, frankly, yes, they are. Because clearly, if you are a Dune fan, you're going to like, and this is the good news, this is actually Shining Ray, which it's really shocking, which is that they say this stays very close to the book in terms of the plot, in terms of the basic themes. In fact, they got annoyed that Denis was a little too focused on certain details about Arrakis or the soil or just going way too in depth about stuff. So, in terms of all these clickbait articles or videos really getting upset, and again, I'm going to be frank, I shared some of these fears that it was going too far from the book. It's not true. He's actually keeping fairly close to the book. So, in terms of the fears that he was going to go crazy or radical, do his own thing, he is changing a few things, but again, apparently we are getting most of the book, and it is trying to be very faithful to the dialogue and plot points. If that was your worry about what Denis was up to, don't worry. Most of the film is going to be very close to the text, which surprises me because just with the late Kynes controversy and other things, we thought, and again, even with Rebecca, I was very fearful he was going to go too far, but apparently, like, no, it's mostly faithful. But apparently, that's their problem. It's a little too faithful. It's trying to be too serious. It's trying to be too literary. It's just not exciting enough. It's not cinematic enough. It's a mixed bag, but I do think it's heartening news. So if you are a fan, mostly people are positive. Mild critics are also very positive, and the people who are negative are just a very small minority. But it is a very vocal minority. This is influential. These are establishment critics. Their voice does matter. And I do think they raise a few good concerns, but a lot of what they're saying is pretty stupid and phony because they clearly don't know the books and they don't know the mythology. Their complaints are coming from a very weak place, but nevertheless, I think this will matter to at least the general public, and people who might see this twice or three times are probably just going to give it one try and say, yeah, it was interesting, it was okay, but that's disappointing. So clearly a part of the audience will be left out. But remember, this is the 2 hour, 45-minute cut that the critics saw and the fans saw. So perhaps the 3 hour cut might have been a different story, but that's another video for another time. So the reception is mainly positive, but a lot of what they bring up is out of pure ignorance, and they don't really seem to understand the books carefully or the mythology carefully, so we can kind of ignore a lot of what they're saying. But they do bring up some decent, legitimate points I think the fandom is going to have to grapple with, and is probably going to lower the popularity and constrain the audience that could have been a lot larger, and I think we want to debate that honestly. But yeah, unfortunately, yeah, I'd be willing to give these critics a chance, but I think a lot of them just have no idea what the hell they're talking about. It's just a lot of ignorant remarks, and they just want to be negative, which is unfortunate because I do think Denis is giving us a sincere try and apparently a very faithful try at translating the novel to us. But there we are. I'll see positive. Some mixed people and a small minority, but very vocal minority that is very negative towards the movie. And that's where we stand with the initial reviews of Dune as it premieres in the world today. Thank you for listening.